Hey everybody, Colton Lindsay here, and I'm going to be doing our first reading summary video for Module 1. And I particularly looked at the article Service Learning Enhances Education for Young Adolescents, and this was written by Kathy Payne and Betty Edwards. So let's dive right in and talk about this. Really, the article was talking about the main thing that it wanted to talk about was the effects, the positive effects mostly, of service learning being implemented within the school system. And so ultimately what it talked about, the article broke down that service learning can help to reinforce learning for middle grade students. This is for the middle school, 6th, 7th, 8th, possibly ninth grade students, middle school and junior high age kids. And ultimately what it's saying is, that at this age group, they're active learners. They want to be active. And, service learning is an opportunity to incorporate that activeness and that need to be moving and doing within the four main disciplines of school, as well as some of the elective disciplines as well. This also, it talked about how service learning helps with socialization and the developing of independence in students of this age, which makes a lot of sense. This is getting them up, getting them active, getting them talking with one another and using those critical thinking skills. So ultimately, service learning, I would agree with this. Yes, it absolutely helps with socialization and the developing of independence. And then finally, the article discusses how service learning helps to develop competencies and civic skills needed for adulthood. So basically working on these skills that children are going to need as they move into adulthood, and how they can function within society. Service learning helps them do that, according to the article. So let's dive right in. Ultimately, this article was divided into two sections. So first, it talked about how some of the negative facts of middle grade student life and how some negative experiences affect particularly the dropout rate, as well as how this really, traditional learning is not for all students. And so it talks a little bit about that. And then the second part of the article really gets into service learning and how this can help to positively impact not only the dropout rate, but as well as student performance and their engagement within the classroom environment. So we're going to start off with some of the more negative things that it talked about. So first off, one of the biggest things that hit me whenever I was reading this article was it talked about how 1 in 3 students do not graduate high school, which that seems like a very severe number. I didn't know it was that severe, so definitely something to wake you up as you're reading this. And then it talked about how students, they don't really determine that school is not for them within high school. It's more or less at the early stages of these middle age and middle grades. 6th grade is really when they start to see that idea develop. Possibly the article talked about how they do poorly on a really big or a standardized test. They get a bad grade in one of their core classes, and this starts to kind of plant the idea that school might not be for them at this point, and it's at a pretty early age. And then it also talked about how dropouts are students that drop out of high school, not dropouts. So I apologize. I typed that for shortness purposes, for brevity's sake. But it talks about how students that drop out of high school or earlier on are more likely to be incarcerated. They are more likely to rely on social services and public programs, and then also they're more likely to go without health insurance for the majority of their life. So it's some pretty big impacts just from not finishing their schooling, their high school degrees. And then another really big number here, 47% of dropouts left school because they said that classes, and this was quoting from the article, that classes were uninteresting. And that was ultimately, so nearly half the students that end up dropping out said it was because school and the classes that they were taking were just not for them and they just didn't interest them. So now we're going to jump into some of the more positive facts that the article presented. So ultimately, it talked about how, and I mentioned this earlier, active learning is so much greater to students of these middle grades than passive learning. So actually getting out and doing is far more effective for them at this stage in their brain development than sitting in the desk and listening to a lecture. And then helping to connect learning to real life situations is really positive for this age. So a lot of as a teacher, a lot of the questions I get within my English classes is, when am I ever going to use this? And ultimately, I feel as a teacher, it's our job to be able to take those things that we're learning. So take Shakespeare, take metrical poetry, all of these different standards that we're teaching them, and to be able to connect that to real life events and real life happenings that they are going to be using this. So ultimately, that's our job as teachers, and I feel that that's something that we owe our students. Because we would expect the same thing if we asked such questions. And then it talked about how a desire to connect to something bigger. Ultimately, students at this age are, and in this day and age, are wanting to be more involved. They want to make a difference within their communities and within the world as at large. So ultimately, people are becoming more aware because of the wonders of social media, the connection through technology. Kids in the middle grade levels are seeing all of this stuff and really experiencing it for the first time through social media and want to experience it in their own lives. So a desire to really be a part of something is huge at this age. And then, of course, service learning helps to develop leadership and interpersonal skills. I mean, I think that kind of goes without saying. Doing projects that help that connect learning and your community, and helping to provide a service is definitely a way to develop leadership skills and interpersonal skills. Ultimately, you're building better human beings with doing this. You're allowing students to really connect and to experience learning outside of the classroom, which is pretty cool. I think that's really interesting. And then now we're going to talk about some more surprising or interesting information that the article presented. This one was shocking, kind of like the 1 in 3 students will drop out of high school rate. This is the daily drop rate that the article mentioned, and it said about 7,200 students per day. So if we take that 1 in 3, like 7,200 students, so 7,200 students per day drop out of high school. So that's a huge number. Very, very shocking, and definitely something I did not expect when reading the article. And then ultimately, the article talked a lot about how there are multiple ways to connect service learning to the core disciplines, which was one of my biggest questions. How do I connect this type of activity and this type of teaching to English, which is what I teach? And it really helped to provide with some examples that it talked about. Like, it talked about all the different disciplines in one example, but I was like, that really makes sense. Using technology and blogs and social media to teach English and grammar and all these different standards we have to teach is a wonderful way to really connect students to on a more personal level. Hey, yes, we're reading about these canonized works of literature, but we're also really getting to see how this connects to our daily lives and how we can use what we learn from these writers in our daily lives. So pretty neat. And then basically the article talked about how high student interest equals a high student engagement, which I think is pretty obvious. I think that's definitely something we work towards as educators, but I think it's always something we can be reminded of. Definitely high interest equals high engagement, which means for better teaching and better learning environment. So here are some of the questions that I had after reading this article. Ultimately, I had two. How can we make this a sustainable model within public schools? I think that's a big question because, we have a certain amount of teachers to teach a certain amount of students and a certain amount of funding to be able to do that. And so how can we make service learning, if we're wanting to implement this within the classroom, how can we make this sustainable for the public school systems to make this a school-wide initiative instead of just a one class doing this. Now, I know we see a lot of this in East, classes such as East, but I don't think that we're really getting the same kind of learning as far as the main core disciplines within that classroom environment. And that's my biggest question: is how can we implement the four core disciplines while making this a sustainable model for teaching them within public schools? So something interesting to keep in mind. And then ultimately my final question was, how can teachers collaborate to connect projects to multiple core disciplines? So I think that this question goes back to help answer my first question. To make this work and to make this sustainable, I feel like this would have to be a collaborative effort from teachers. So teachers in English, math, science, and social studies would have to get together and would have to connect these projects so that we can use one project to house all of these disciplines. So I think that that's something that would have to definitely be something we think about and have to talk about a lot as far as making this sustainable. So those are my biggest questions after reading the article. As far as connecting this to students and schools and my experience as a teacher, I think collaboration between disciplines and subject matter is a big thing that the article talks about, and it's something that could be really helpful for a school system if it's not something that's already being done quite a bit. I know that we do teams, which are going to be cross-discipline meetings with teachers. However, I would like to see more of this. More cross-discipline projects would be really neat to see within the school system. And then I really liked, as I stated earlier, the use of social media and blogs to display knowledge of English skills. So as I talked about how while I was reading the article, my biggest question was, how do I connect this to my discipline of English? And it did talk about using social media and blogs. And I think that's a really neat way to do this. Ultimately, I don't feel like that's something that a lot of classrooms are doing today. And I feel like it might be really interesting to see how students react to the incorporation of things that are ultimately distractions within the classroom as one of the main formats for submitting and collaborating with their peers. So it'd be really neat to see. And then the article talks about how service learning engages with those students who are just not drawn to traditional learning methods. I could sit and listen to a lecture in the English field for hours. It's something that interests me, and that's how I learn best, is just sitting there and listening and reading and talking with my peers. That's not for everybody, though. I think ultimately that is something that we as educators have to realize and have to adapt to, and I think it's something that we may not always understand at first, because I feel that we are as educators typically lifelong students. We want to be lifelong students because it interested us when we were in the school system. So engaging these kids who are just not really traditional learners and don't really respond well to traditional learning methods is really cool, and I think service learning would be a great way to do that. And the article gives several examples on how that could possibly work. And here are my references. This is the reference for the article that I read. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope that this was helpful and informative. And I apologize if I've been sniffling a little bit. I've been suffering from a little bit of a cold. But thank you guys for bearing with me, and I hope that this helped. I look forward to listening to your summarizations of your own articles. Thank you.